On behalf of Cleveland SHRM Board of Directors, hello and thank you for joining us for today's virtual learning titled Beyond the Black Box, How Your Organization Can Support Black and Diverse Employees. This program is part of Cleveland SHRM's virtual learning series of an ongoing schedule of webcasts. Additional virtual learning opportunities are available through clevelandSHRM.com. Before we start today's program, we'd like to provide you with guidance on the meeting. If you send us a request for technical assistance, we'll do our best to respond quickly, but there may be a delay. Most technical issues like slides not advancing or the sound breaking up can be resolved by refreshing your web browser or pressing F5 on your PC. A slide deck of the presentation will be made available after the program. If you have questions for Chi-Chi or Bethany, please utilize the chat feature in the action tray on the screen. We will do our best to answer as many questions as we can throughout the program. And now about today's program. Many organizations posted a social media response confirming their dedication to supporting Black employees and consumers. However, many advocates and allies are asking, what else can we do to enhance equity? Join us for a conversation discussing groundbreaking best practices, limitations within current systems, and recommendations to keep your organization moving towards long-term equity and growth. We have two presenters today, Bethany Studenist. Bethany is the co-founder and managing director of Enlighten Solutions, a nonprofit focusing on assisting individuals and organizations in implementing local research-based solutions. With over a decade of experience in fundraising, counseling, lobbying, and policy reform, Bethany utilizes a wide skill set rooted in her education in social work and law to help organizations and individuals achieve their equality goals. Chi-Chi Nkamara is the co-founder and strategic director of Enlighten Solutions. She has over 10 years of experience in community and digital engagement and advocacy. Chi-Chi holds a bachelor's in political science and African American studies from the Ohio State University and immediately moved to Houston to serve as a Teach for America educator. As public safety and workplace advocate, she is dedicated to progressive and transformative community development. I am pleased to pass the controls to Bethany.
Good morning, everyone. We are excited to have you with us. Just want to get started and talk a little bit about our organization. So we are Enlighten Solutions. We're excited to chat with you today. Today, we're going to be talking about Beyond the Black Box, how you can be more supportive of diverse employees and consumers. I'm here with my co-founder, Chi-Chi. We founded Enlighten Solutions together in 2018. We are a nonprofit organization. We do a couple of different things. We serve individuals who are affected by systemic challenges in their careers. We complete research focused on the life experience and lived experiences of people of diversity. And we work with organizations implementing solutions that have been grown from the ground up through our conversations and advocacy work. Just to introduce myself a little bit. Again, I'm Bethany. I'm a social worker. I'm an advocate. I'm a licensed counselor. I have my Juris Doctor, so I know a little bit about law. And I've been doing government and nonprofit work as well as public sector work for over a decade. I've served in a variety of roles, from working directly with disenfranchised populations to working in lobbying and fundraising. And Chi-Chi and I actually met when we were doing police reform work for the city of Cleveland. So we have a diverse background between the two of us that we apply to supporting our individuals and organizations.
And thank you so much. Good morning, I'm Chi-Chi, obviously. As Bethany said, we met in about 2017 doing police reform for the city of Cleveland and the Department of Justice, and I continue to do that work outside of this, workplace advocacy. I really enjoy speaking to organizations and individuals about strategic communications, making sure those difficult conversations are productive and fruitful. And my background in middle school teaching definitely primed me for that, definitely allowed me to have the patience and wherewithal to be able to do that. So I am so grateful that you all allowed both of us to join you guys this morning. So to kick us off, I really do believe that whenever we have these types of workshops, these types of discussions, we need to have common language. And today, we're really going to be drilling down on the idea of racism, the structure of racism. Now, there are 5 main classifications for American racism, but for our purposes today, we're only going to explore the 2 most relevant ones, which are individual racism, that's one-on-one, and structural racism, which is a little bit more nebulous, but will make a lot more sense as we go through. So, individual racism, probably the most known and the most common. It is the belief, attitude, action, and the inaction of individuals that perpetuate and support racism. So individual racism can be deliberate or it can be unconscious, things that you're not necessarily actively doing, but the result still is individual interpersonal racism. So what I mean by that, a little bit more detail, that means jokes, epithets, avoidance, fear, acceptance, or collusion that there is an inherent or moral superiority of typically Western cultural practices, ideas, history, worldview, politics. It could be dress, it could be music, it could be all kinds of different things. But is that individual, typically one-on-one or one-on person-to-person type of racism. So an example that we have gotten in our work is a woman named Sharon, a Black woman, wears a new braided hairstyle to work. And Sharon's manager, Danielle, lightly touches the ends of Sharon's hair, stating that her hair is kind of hardcore and maybe just like a little bit unprofessional. That is individual racism. And even though you may be thinking, oh, that's really benign, Danielle's a little old school, Danielle's a little touchy-feely, that kind of one-on-one person-to-person racism would not occur if Danielle and Sharon were of the same race. It just wouldn't happen. You would not invade that person's space like that. And also, braided hairstyles are culturally specific. They're culturally specific mainly to Black, sometimes to Latino populations. It's a way to protect your hair. It's a way to show cultural pride. And for Danielle to kind of dismiss that hairstyle as unprofessional or hardcore, that is individual racism.
Right, and turning to the systemic piece of it, so we want to differentiate between these 2 concepts a little bit because we get them conflated a lot whenever we're talking about race and race relations inside organizations. And so there's individual things where we have our biases and they affect those systems, but then we have systemic problems where it's a normalization of race-based power dynamics that advantage white individuals and culture while compounding adverse outcomes for Black people and people of color. This can inhabit all aspects of life. It can't be contained or identified in one industry or institution, which makes it the most pervasive type. And what we mean by that is every industry is different. So the structures and systems inside of those industries, inside of those organizations can look very different depending on how policies and procedures have been impacting Black communities and how the way in which we structured systems that then combine with individual biases to really produce an effect that is disadvantaging Black communities particularly, but all kinds of marginalization as well. Showing a little bit of detail and an example of this, we have Western holidays and cultural practices, music, clothing, hairstyles and textures, history, accolades, economic and political structures are all very much based on a normative view of white Western history and culture, right? An example of this, kind of building off of what Chi-Chi is talking about when we talk about hair, is the Crown Act of 2019. It aims to protect against systemic discrimination based on race-based hairstyles. It extends statutory protection for hair textures and protective styles such as braids, locks, twists, and knots in the workplace and public. Again, what we're talking about here is, one was an example of individual misunderstanding or dismissiveness about culture and background. And now we're talking about policies and procedures systemically that have said, you can't have braids at work, you can't have this hair texture at work, you have to change your hair, damage your hair to look more like a white understanding of what professionalism looks like. So that's kind of the differentiation there. So to talk a little bit about traditional diversity and inclusion efforts, things that we have been using in the past or using for a very long time to try and facilitate diversity and inclusion at work. What we can tell from the social movement and conversation right now is that these are not having the impact that we want them to have, right? It's not working, and it's not working moving forward because the conversation has changed, the definitions have changed, and the level of accountability that people want to see has also changed. So we want to touch real quick on the concept of the black box and performance. So organizations and individuals during this conversation online had posted a lot of black boxes to illustrate from anything from solidarity to acknowledgement of the Black Lives Matter movement to anti-racism action. But whenever we are talking about performativeness, we want to think about what we're putting out into the world and why we're putting it out in there. So performative allyship is more concerned with an individual or an organization's own feelings and processing about what is challenging rather than changing those biases. And so it's more an organization putting a black box out, right? And then not ever looking internally and thinking about how do we dismantle the things that have disadvantaged and disenfranchised people of diversity for many years. So here's some tips on thinking about and thinking through performativeness. And the reason we bring this up is because advocates and the nation in general are having this conversation about really holding accountability, really looking internally, really thinking about substance, really taking personal responsibility. And so it's important that organizations are moving into this lane and understanding what's performative and what's really substantive, and how do we utilize those things. So performative allyship or performative posts can be things that don't really share anything new. They lack next steps or policy changes or strategy changes. They really think about signaling what your beliefs are, what your organization's beliefs are, but don't really talk about what you're doing to support diverse communities. They can sometimes express outrage or shock, but don't really think about what are the tangible solutions here, what can we really change? They focus often on one instance rather than systemic problems. So they'll point out one particular problem, maybe with another organization or another industry, but they don't think about the systemic problems that led to that particular issue and how often that issue probably happened. They often solicit praise or approval and don't really facilitate conversation or more in-depth analysis. An example here on the individual side, you see these photos here that we have. They were Instagram influencers who went out during protests, got all nice and dressed up, and took photos using the protest essentially as a backdrop for their social media. So without really doing substantively anything for the movement or holding anyone accountable, they were using the pain of an entire race and a movement as a backdrop for their Instagram. That's hurtful and unhelpful in the conversation.
If we can go back one slide, just one moment,
Sure.
Just to add a little bit to that performative thought is, especially for organizations, you really have to ask yourself, especially if you are representing an organization from the marketing or strategic communications or internal communications department, you need to ask yourself truly, am I posting this, or am I sending this email list, or am I putting out this press release as content, or am I actually affirming values that we have in this company that we would like to reaffirm in the public space? So it's that content versus actual substance that will make your organization relevant. And it has to be intentional. I'm seeing a lot of individuals in the chat room talk about how intentional are you going to be when you are making these posts? How intentional are you going to be when you're sending these press releases or these email lists? You need to make sure that your intentions are aligned with the things that you're actually going to do, or you are going to be an organization that for lack of a better word, is going to be on the Summer Jam screen. You guys are going to be online in a very hyper visible way. And we have a really tangible expression of this that happened not even 3 weeks ago with a particular organization. So Refinery 29. Full disclosure, I quite like this publication. And when I saw this happen in the public domain, I was pretty shocked. And shocked in the sense of I wish somebody had sent them this presentation before doing anything. So really quickly, in early June, Refinery 29 changed their typically jewel tone brand colors. They use a lot of oranges, pink, millennial, yellow. They changed those brand colors to a black box. And it was to signify to the public that they supported their Black employees internally, and they supported the greater Black Lives Matter movement for racial equity and substantive systemic change, right? So they put this post up and they were ready to receive all of the accolades and all of the well wishes from individual followers like me that would be able to see it. However, the issue became when former and anonymous employees saw that post, they immediately went to Twitter, to Instagram, to Medium.com, to Facebook, and disclosed that within Refinery 29's actual organization, there was racial segregation, hyper racial segregation. There were increased pay disparities between individuals doing the same work, but of different races or different sects. And there was general workplace hypocrisy on social media. And a really good pull-out quote from a CNN article about this, pretty long-form article, was, despite the inclusive image that the site tried to present, the CEO, a woman, Barbaric, made a number of editorial decisions that had the effect of diminishing minority and especially Black women within this media company. So as we said, Refinery 29 is a media company for young millennial women. They are supposed to be really inclusive with news, with opinion pieces, with politics, all kinds of things. But the CEO had a habit of diminishing and marginalizing Black women within the company, even though their public face showed a little bit more inclusivity on their social media platform. So some examples, the CEO repeatedly confused one Black employee with another Black employee. That is individual racism. If you cannot take the time to understand the differences between your employees that share similar characteristics, similar, not the same, that is racist. And you have to be able to have the wherewithal within yourself to call that out. That is racist. Now, I'm not saying, oh, maybe Paula and, Pauline have similar names and you call them different names. I mean, if you are consistently confusing two Black employees, you may need to be able to look into yourself. Or if you are watching another employee do that and brush it aside, that is individual racism. Another example, a Black employee online disclosed that she was paid $15,000 less workers with the exact same position, history, and title. That is both individual and structural racism. How is that structural racism? When you start adding economics, when you start adding pricing differentials, you are literally splitting two employees that have the same potential, but one is going to be on an upward trajectory and the other one is going to plateau. And if you are looking at your organization and seeing that your Black and minority employees are plateauing, that is structural racism within your organization. If you are looking at your organization and you are noting that individuals are plateauing, I have to repeat it, that is structural racism. And lastly, and I think this is really important for the HR managers and the diversity consultants that are on this call, the employees at Refinery 29 frequently filed human resources complaints against the CEO because she had editorial choices that were inconsistent with the values of the company. So consistently putting white models or white influencers or lighter toned individuals on their social media platforms. Nevertheless, HR turned around and told those employees that the CEO's actions and any kind of discipline was out of the purview of human resources. That's structural racism. How are you, an HR system, not actually supporting the employees that are calling out biases, systemic biases, individual biases against the CEO, simply because the CEO is of that status? We have to start looking more collectively and holistically in organizations to make sure each and every individual is responsible for anti-racist behavior.
Absolutely, Chi-Chi, fantastic points. And I think I want people to understand too that when we do this work, we really do name the things what they are, right? And so when we say something is individually racist or something is systemically racist, what we're talking about is giving a name to something that we understand and also dividing it and subdividing it so we can really understand the nuances of it. I think that's important. I think it's important to have that shared language. And I know at first, whenever we talk to people, that can be kind of jarring, right? Because we're really coming right out of the gate and telling you, here's this, this, and this. But the truth is, we really need to get honest about these conversations and honest about ourselves. I am a white woman from a rural area. I've had to learn a lot and I've had to unlearn a lot. And I've had moments where I've done things or said things or thought things that would fall into these categories. And I've worked to mitigate that, right? Because that's my background, that's my lens. And that's what we're asking you to do, is just take a step past that discomfort and start really investigating these things and naming them what they're naming them. It doesn't mean if you've fallen into one of these categories or your organization falls into one of these categories that you're terrible, that you need to feel like an awful person. But it does mean let's take accountability for this, let's name it what it is, and let's have an honest conversation about that. So to talk a little bit about mitigating performative allyship, I think that it's important that organizations are prepared to do some of that heavy lifting, both at the organizational level and at the personal level. Really, we see these two problems combined. We see structures that are set up a certain way and individual biases combined to really, really mitigate or really, really marginalize communities. We need to do more than relying on a chief diversity officer or director and placing it all in one hand. Sometimes what we see with organizations is they'll say, we have a chief diversity officer. And what happens is they've taken all of this work and put it on one person. And instead of everyone taking responsibility for really looking at themselves, looking at how they apply policies, looking at the policies themselves, they're saying, we hired a person, it's their job to think about it. If it's not working, then it's their fault. Yeah. If this person isn't empowered to make these types of changes and isn't empowered to really raise their voice in that way, then the effects really are to tokenize someone rather than to make substantive change or to do anti-racist work. Yeah. Each and every employee is responsible for supporting and fostering that diverse and inclusive workplace, and it really can't just be on the shoulders of one person or one department. It's just not adequate. Black and minority consumers and employees are not responsible for educating about, dissecting, and dismantling these problems. One thing we see a lot is employers relying on their Black employees, their diverse employees, to fix the systems that have been built. And what we're saying there is what you're asking is that someone share their personal difficult experiences with you without pay, without additional benefits, in order to help you learn. And that's really unfair. What you're really asking is you're putting people in a situation where they need to challenge you, challenge your beliefs in order to make change, but at the same time, you're not really putting them in a position to win or to advance their career. So it's really a lose-lose whenever you put employees in this situation. So we really say, let's not be relying on only our Black employees, only our Black consumers, only our Black friends to educate us. We need to be doing that ourselves, and we need to be engaging with experts who are paid and compensated to do this work rather than trying to pull it out internally.
So, as you all can definitely see, the future is diverse. We cannot ignore the fact that our world is so rapidly changing. I'm 32, right? 10 years ago when I graduated from college, the world was completely different. I still had the internet, Twitter was still a thing. However, the way that we are mobilizing online, the way that individuals are sharing information, the way that we are able to connect with each other in an almost instantaneous fashion illustrates that more ideas are entering the marketplace, which allows us to be really freed of the idea that only one perspective is valid. Economic and civic forces are fundamentally shifting. And what we need to understand is that social media is forever. I remember when my parents were telling me this in high school, like, oh, it's forever. And now I'm reminding them it's forever. So whatever organizations are putting out there on social media, hypocrisy is easier to point out today than ever. Before, if you didn't have the newspaper right there to cite or an encyclopedia to cite somebody, I mean, that could get lost. Right now, we have computers in our hands, and it's so easy to be able to illustrate what you said yesterday is not jiving with what you are doing today. Next, the oldest members of Generation Z, the generation right behind me. I'm a millennial, I'm a middle millennial. These members of Gen Z are graduating college this year or entering the adult workforce this year. They are about 22, 23 right now. They are the most educated generation in American history. And I don't just mean just book smart educated. These young people are educated through various means, experiential education. They go out and they experience the world differently. Also online, they are privy to so much more information than I was 10 years ago. They are light years ahead of me. And to be able to understand that, is to be able to understand that 48% of these individuals, these Gen Z youth, they are ethnically and racially diverse. And if we were to drill down even more than that, they are sexually diverse, they are gender expression diverse, they are all kinds of diversities and all kinds of intersections. And for your organization or for you as an individual to be able to progress, you need to not only acknowledge that, but you need to uplift that kind of diversity. And lastly, we are in the midst of a pandemic. Obviously, we are doing this via Zoom because of this. COVID-19 and racial social movements and systemic changes, as we have been talking about today, have fundamentally shaped the next generation. They are fundamentally changed. So if we are understanding this, we are able to shape and shift the future in a way that is highly inclusive of their perspective and doesn't come off as performative, doesn't come off as inauthentic. Authenticity is key for this next generation, and you have to be able to uplift that and acknowledge that.
Right, and building off of what Chi-Chi's saying, when you're thinking about organizations, millennials and Gen Z in the next 10 years are going to be the largest economic driver of our economy. So they're going to be your future consumers, but they're also going to be your future employees. And their demands are, significantly more focused on equality. They see that as a basic tenet of what they're looking for. They're much more tuned in to equality issues. So if you're thinking about competing for talent in the next 10 years, it's really important that you're doing this work because it's going to be an expectation of the generation that is coming into the workforce. And one thing I'll note here, I know that we have a primarily Northeast Ohio audience on this call, and I want to point out that Northeast Ohio is not doing very well on these metrics when compared to national statistics. So earlier this year, there was a research article that ranked Cleveland specifically as the worst place in the nation for Black women to work, live, get education, and healthcare. that means that we place last across the nation. So you can look anywhere, and the pay disparities are significant. The infant mortality rates are significant. We really need to be thinking about Northeast Ohio and our commitment to this, because we're likely to, again, lose talent if we're not really committing to these issues, and our region is going to fall behind. Chi-Chi and I conducted a survey with 77 Black women in Ohio. And one of the questions we have was, have you ever made a report to an employer about harassment on the job based on your race or gender? Of those who had made a report, they, not a single one reported that their harasser was fired. In only 2 cases, was their harasser disciplined, and in 5 cases, they were disciplined themselves. So more often, we're seeing women, Black women particularly, being penalized for making complaints and speaking up, utilizing exactly the systems that we're here to talk about today, those HR systems that we say are designed to protect people who are marginalized. I see a question about, is that Cleveland proper or Northeast Ohio? It was Cleveland proper. So it was Cleveland in general. They surveyed cities with a population, a Black population of 100,000 or more. So the sampling was really focused a little bit more on larger cities. But in that demographic, we really see that Cleveland is lagging behind. And I want to raise this point because I know that the people here have power to be thinking about this. And I want you to be very aware of what the landscape looks like, especially for Black women and Black people here in Northeast Ohio. And as we see those issues that bleed into LGBTQ issues, women's issues, neurodiversity, physical diversity. We are lagging behind. So it's a hard truth, but it is the truth, and we need to start talking about it.
And just a point on, I know that individuals, and this is what we've been combated with, was, oh, well, Cleveland's a city, you know, it's a dying city, but outside the metropolitan areas are doing far better. And we want to be here to tell you all, it is not. It is not. Whatever is happening within the city center is bleeding out into the suburbs, it's bleeding out into the exurbs. So we know that many Black women in the city of Cleveland, many Black women that either work or do business in the city of Cleveland are living on the east side exurbs. So that's Bedford, Garfield Heights, Pepper Pike, Orange, all the way to there, stopping probably about Aurora. Those exurbs are still lagging significantly behind. It is not an issue on education. As we know, Black women are far exceeding in their educational pursuits. They're highly educated, above and beyond individuals, their peers across racial lines. It's not an issue of where you're living. It's not an issue of even salary. It's just an issue of these systemic problems bleeding and draining talent. And as Bethany said, I love Cleveland. I came back from Houston, Texas to move right back to Cleveland. And the moment that I stepped off of that plane, I realized, oh boy, it is way different here. It is way more difficult here. And we have to be able to set up systems so that this region in general can thrive. Imagine if all Black women in this city were able to be empowered, right? Let's just close the pay gap and see how much economic power we could have in this city. Let's close the infant mortality gap and see how we are having thriving communities. So this is a sustainability argument that we're making here.
Absolutely. And I see a comment here saying it's not normal for an employee who files a complaint to be informed about actions taken against another employee, in my experience. So one thing about our data is we don't ask for external verification of someone's life story. So if they're telling us about their experience, we take them at their word. We don't question it. And if we're seeing that pattern over and over and over again in the conversations that we have with a particular demographic, we can see that that data is pretty reliable because we're seeing it as an independent verification. And so when we're talking about that, that's what we're discussing. I also will say, you know, Chi-Chi and I have been involved in quite a few employee investigations, and it's not necessarily, you will know if someone is fired or not based on their presence, right? So sometimes you may not know exactly what action is taken, but you will know visually what's happened. But there are certainly times where I've seen exactly what actions are taken has been shared. with every party. So just want to give that caveat on the data. We tend to rely on it, and it has its own internal validities. So talking a little bit, we want to talk a little bit to traditional D&I strategies that have been used and some of the limitations we see. We're not saying that any of these resources are not useful. They are, and they can be very useful, but usually in terms of an overall plan. What we normally see is that employers kind of implement one or two and start to see they see that as kind of the entire initiative, and we like to put that inside of a larger plan. So we utilize additional tools, but we're going to talk a little bit about some of these like ad hoc tools that employers use. One of those is employee resource groups. So those are generally affinity groups inside organizations. It might be a women's group, it might be an African-American group, it may be something different. And they can be very useful for building camaraderie, having support systems, talking about new ideas, discussing frustrations, things along those lines. However, we do see some limitations whenever they're used kind of on their own. Generally, these resource groups are not empowered to initiate change. They don't have any specific goals or mandates, and so they can be kind of challenging for the participants because it will feel like, we're coming together, we're sitting, we're talking about these things, but nothing changes. And so it can feel kind of like a futile effort for individuals without the right type of guidance and implementation support. It also, again, going back to our conversation about relying and leaning on Black employees and diverse employees, we often see employers really putting diverse employees in these groups and then not putting what they would consider non-diverse employees in those groups in order to learn or to expand their skill set. And so what we're seeing is, again, a type of segregation. We're seeing that we're putting people in boxes, we're keeping them in boxes, and we're hoping that that will solve the problem. And without additional support, we really see that as something that can be very limiting.
So next is probably the most common that we're seeing in the last 2 to 3 years is unconscious bias training. And that is a training that discusses the neurology of biases and schema of preference. It's generally a 1-day or 2-day training, and it's sometimes offered every single year. Now, there are strengths to this. We don't dismiss this. Some of the strengths is that it's educational, and it's an educational discussion of people's preferences. Secondly, it's a primer on race and general diversity. We have talked in other sessions within our own organization about racial illiteracy, right? A lot of individuals are illiterate on what race is in their day-to-day life, and also the history of racism within the country. So unconscious bias training really does explore this. And lastly, it explores the basics of bias in human thinking. So it is a strength. Nevertheless, there are a couple of limitations to this. One-time trainings do not change behavior. You cannot get trained in anti-racist behavior once, and then you are magically a perfect person. I am a Black person, obviously. I am a Nigerian woman living in America, obviously. There are still anti-racist actions that I have to take daily. And that doesn't exclude me just because I am a member of an in-group. And it doesn't exclude me just because I've taken one time of a training. Next, it's not offered frequently enough to be in-depth or personal. As you know, it takes 21 days to form a habit. If you're doing one racial bias training once a year, you're not reinforcing best practices. Next, unconscious bias training does not explore accountability. That is overall company-wide accountability, and that also is internal accountability. What are you doing internally to make sure that you are actually being accountable to your diverse employees, the people of color that you work with day to day, that you are righting those wrongs that you may have inflicted, or that your organization may be inflicting on the public? How are you being accountable? And lastly, unconscious bias training, and this is probably the most personal for me, to be very frank, is that it's isolating for Black employees and people of color. When there are very few of you within an office, and everybody's going through unconscious bias training, and you're talking about racism, and then everyone turns to you, the one or two Black or brown people in the organization, and they are asking you to talk about racism. I don't want to talk about racism with Bill from accounting. I don't. I want to go back to my desk and do my work. So we have to be conscious about how we are doing these trainings and how we are not, maybe tacitly, isolating and segregating Black and employees of color.
Another piece that we would like to draw your eye to is just basic standards training. So we're talking about your harassment training, your basic legal standards, probably part of your onboarding process. And again, we're not saying that any of these interventions are not useful. They are useful. We just like to see them as part of an overall plan. And we're showing limitations because we have other things that we would use in conjunction with these pieces to make sure that you're really hitting the nail on the head. So some of the strengths of trainings like this is that it provides, again, that basic legal requirement and background. What are our real goals? What are the standards that we are held to legally? That's important for people to know. It gives protection for employers. It's important that you're having this conversation, that you can show that you're having this conversation, that you're being proactive about it. It raises those basic issues with staff, and again, starts the conversation about just basic literacy and understanding about some of these issues. However, we've looked at some academic reviews that have surveyed trainings like this over a long period of time. And what we found is most of the information included in trainings like this have remained relatively unchanged since 1980. And part of that's because the law has changed, but not a whole lot to really see a complete revamp of trainings like this. So we're really giving information that has remained pretty stagnant as the conversation publicly has changed very quickly. It doesn't really talk about modifying behavior or the environment. It doesn't talk about, intervening if you're seeing a problem traditionally. Now, I'm not saying everybody has the same training, but this is what we're talking about from the consultant's perspective of what we see. And, they're the absolute minimum, right? This is where we should be thinking about what's our legal liability, and it's important that we're having that conversation, but at the same time, the social environment is demanding that you're doing more than the basic legal requirements. And it doesn't address things like microaggressions or systemic racism or individual racism quite the way or as in depth or as much nuance as we'd like to see. So those are some of the limitations we see with that, and we like to expound upon trainings like this.
And lastly, employee surveys and ratings. As you all know what a survey is, a survey that requests feedback from employees and stakeholders, and it's often using anonymous feedback, so making sure that employees are kind of protected and insulated from some of the ideas that they would like to put forth for the company or the organization. So strength, I love a survey. It's an excellent source of qualitative and quantitative feedback. Next, it provides employees a resource and a voice. It really invests employees. So, nevertheless, there are limitations. It's useful for identifying problems, but not really useful for finding solutions. There's not really a lot of surveys that are long form that individuals can put in their solutions. Also, it's a lot of onus on one individual to be able to solve systemic problems in an organization. Next, it's not generally a part of a larger structural shift. It's usually just a way to be able to gauge the temperature of the organization. And lastly, it's really identifying for Black employees and employees of color. If you're talking about racism, typically, if you're talking about it from a personal perspective, right, you're going to be identified. Now, clearly there are individuals that can speak to racism more holistically, but if you're saying I was the recipient of a racist action, that's pretty identifying. Now, I do want to make time for some of your questions. There was one that came up that said about BRGs are open and inclusive to every employee. Yes, of course they are. But again, sometimes just because it's open and inclusive for all employees doesn't necessarily mean that it's still not an isolating thing. And it still doesn't mean that it is not an identifying thing. So let's just say if you're having friction with your manager and you're able to, discuss this in an open and honest manner, what makes your manager not want to perhaps put a little extra strain on you because of some of the ideas that you have disclosed to the public? Again, we are all just human beings. We are just human. Sometimes we get iffy, sometimes we brush up against each other. And again, we're trying to build systems, 21st century systems, that allow us to have open and free dialogue without having the ramifications of systemic issues. We're only talking about racism here today, but there is sexism, there is homophobia, there are all kinds of different systems that end up compounding employees, and we want to, again, mitigate that damage. And then lastly, before we go into 21st century intervention, I got a question that says, can I talk about the indirect pressure that I may feel to educate white counterparts? Really quickly, I don't feel any pressure because I don't particularly do that. Bethany essentially came to me as a fully formed human being. We learn from each other every single day. I have tons of white friends, but I have not surrounded myself, and I've been very lucky to have friends that are allies and active individuals without me being there. Me being there did not institute or create any kind of necessity for them. They would have been doing it if we were not friends, essentially, or if we were not employees, essentially. So I don't necessarily feel any kind of pressure in that way. So going on to new intervention.
Yeah, so jumping in here, we want to just give a couple of examples of other interventions that we utilize with organizations. Generally, when we work with an organization, we really start in a very comprehensive conversation about what you've done historically, what the literacy level in your organization is like, how it's made up, what it looks like. And it's really important because a lot of organizations have invested in diversity and inclusion work. And whenever working with you, we want to make sure that we're building on top of things that you've already done, and also recommending things that are relevant to your industry and your culture and the people inside your organization, to ensure that we have a million different recommendations we can make. We want to make sure we're making the right ones for our clients and the people that we're working with. We often say diversity work is diverse. There's not a one size fits all solution here, but here are some different things that we use that are kind of in our toolbox. So we start with that census and that historical analysis, and it really does help us create space to process the needs of staff and leadership. And part of that too is having a conversation individually about where you're at, what your literacy level is, what you need to learn. Chi-Chi and I are very frank about it. Tell us, do you need the definitions? Do you want to start here? Do you feel uncomfortable talking about this? Do you need a shared language to start out? And we build that with our clients, because we want people to be able to model and feel comfortable talking about these issues, because if we can't talk about them, we can't fix them. I'm going to let Chi-Chi talk about individual coaching.
Cool. So individual coaching, exactly what it means. It creates a customized space to discuss personal learning and progress. It's really important for C-suite executives, managers to be able to get that kind of individual one-on-one coaching, because it supports leadership in modeling behavior for subordinates. Again, we are all here for ground-up solutions, but certain behavior has to be modeled throughout the organization for it to be able to be foundational. Also, individual coaching increases racial literacy in a private space. So it allows real processing and education. Again, anti-racist work is messy, and there are a lot of individuals that feel like if they don't get the terminology immediately correct every single time, that they're not going to do it. And that's not the way that this works. I consistently educate myself on LGBT issues as a cisgender straight woman because I want to be an ally for those individuals, regardless of if they're working with me, regardless of anything. It's because my literacy in that area, that private learning that I do outside of any kind of public work that I do, is necessary, in my opinion, to be a very fully formed individual.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So policy and document review, what we enjoy doing, because we are nerdy like that, we love reviewing existing documents and policies and related materials. We want to see what exactly is on the paper and see kind of the disconnect with what is happening in action. It gives us a comprehensive approach that integrates the work product of the organization, again, with the actual implementation of those policies. It also allows us as consultants to lead custom solutions that fit within existing structures. It gives us a bit of individuality. It gives us a bit of creativity to be able to look at policies that may have been written 10 years ago that may not be relevant for today. As I said before, the world is rapidly changing. We should be rapidly changing with the world. And lastly, just as I've been saying, it analyzes and finds inconsistencies in implementation. It allows us to see what's happening in the real world versus what is happening on pen and paper.
Absolutely. So let's answer a couple questions here. We have just, I think, 2 slides left, so we're almost here to the end. Yep. But I see that, we see a couple people are talking about, it can be hard with surveys. And again, we love a good survey. We use them very often, but we also just don't use them on their own. And we generally partner them with think tanks, which is what I'll talk about next, where we go more in depth on the survey results and we leverage internal resources to generate solutions. I also see a question over here in our Q&A. Do you think the hiring of a diversity officer could have a backfire effect for companies that they put the D&I work on one person and their hiring of the position gives the company some moral licensing to point to that decision as a step in the right direction, and therefore they give up on a more broad and comprehensive effort in regards to inclusion? Thank you for that question. I think you almost answered it yourself because yes, we agree with that. We know that this type of work, it just doesn't work if not everyone in the organization is modeling it and looking at it and doing the active work and really kind of investigating their own biases and understanding. And so when we see it really the onus is put on one person, essentially what we're saying is when something goes wrong, you come to the D&I person and you say, why didn't you fix me? Why didn't you fix this company that you don't have control over? And so that can be very difficult. I see another question here from Stacy. So how do you support white males who often feel villainized by the work of D&I? I get it. Listen, I understand that it can be really daunting. And the truth is, these systems marginalize everyone. And what I want people to understand is that we're all better off by doing this work. We see through COVID and through the other things that we've been through recently that work is not working for everyone. And that includes white men too. And I'm going to tell you why. So we put people in terms of gender. I'm going to switch to gender a little bit here. And we think about women doing a lot of the work at home, and we also know that that's true based on the studies that we've seen. Women are doing a disproportionate amount of work at home while also working in the workplace. And that's a very big challenge for women, but it also says something about the male experience. And that is that there's an expectation that men don't want to spend time with their families, don't value it, don't want to see their children grow up, don't want to be home with their babies, don't want to have that experience. And what we're really saying here is whenever we are all more equal and whenever we are all on firmer footing together, we're actually all going to benefit from this because you're going to have more freedom to do the things that you want to do. Another thing we see really commonly is men have often been told that they can't have feelings. They can't have feelings, they can't have them at work, they can't have them at home. And we see a real lack of support for men in general to really process their feelings or get help with mental health issues. And we see really sad and difficult things that come out of that for men. And so what I want people to understand is this work is not about villainizing anyone. This work is about understanding each other better so that we can all have a better life, a more fulfilling life together. So we try to be very approachable with it. We try to start where you are, and we try to make sure that everybody has some skin in the game, because we all do. We absolutely all do. Okay, so just
Again,
to
anti-racist work, sorry,
go ahead.
just
Go ahead.
as an aside, anti-racist work is not about villainizing a person. And when we start thinking about anti-racist work as we are simply now being, quote, reverse racist to white men, well, that doesn't exist at all, because there are not structures that are pushing down white men in that regard in the workplace. But what we are doing with anti-racist work is freeing individuals from structures, ideas, practices that are actually making their workplace less efficient. Racism is inherently inefficient. It makes no sense. Economically, it doesn't make sense. Socially, it doesn't make sense. It really is a system that it defies logic. And when we are all freed of that system, again, imagine how much greater we will be when we utilize diversity as our strength. But we also have to get tougher about things. We call things out exactly as they are. If it is racist, it is racist, right? But we are not villainizing one specific person. We are making sure that the individuals that are being subjugated in that system are being protected. So if you're feeling villainized, you need to be able to sit in those feelings and figure out why you feel so convicted about it, and then make that change. And then be able to explore that outside of the workplace, be able to explore those feelings outside of your professional setting, so that we can, again, be a more fruitful nation.
Absolutely. And, again, it benefits all of us. And I've told people, we're doing research and we're really lifting up the voices of Black women right now. We're really focused on that in our research. And, people have asked, how do you feel about that when you only share potentially one identity? And my truth is, it as selfish as it sounds, if Black women are doing better, I'm doing better. I'm doing better as a woman. I'm doing better because work is shared. I'm doing better because my organization is going to do better. All of the research shows that when we look at diversity, we're more likely to survive economic downturns. We're more likely to solve problems. We're more likely to be adept in the market. Diverse firms who really facilitate belonging far outperform ones that don't. So I see that as safety, but I also see that as a huge opportunity for me. And also just because it's right. If that's the last argument I have to make, it's the right thing to do. And we have to do it to keep up. So lastly, one thing I want to cover is think tanks and collaborative problem solving. So again, we take that kind of in conjunction with employee surveys. We like to take employee surveys and think tank them with your employees. We do that in a very intentional way. We have a structure that we use, and we go through and have conversations with employees that are selected or stakeholders, and really process the information that comes out of that, and we generate solutions based on that. A lot of your teams have the answers already. It's just a matter of mining them and figuring them out and implementing them and lifting up those voices in a way that makes people feel safe and empowered. Oh, I have one more for you. We have one more.
No, this is my favorite one, though. It's customized and recurring training. Maybe it's because I'm a former teacher and I will always see myself as an educator. You have to reinforce knowledge or it is lost. Training and curated conversations have to be based and tailored to the organization's size and their needs. And to be adding to that, their history. We need to understand that based on neurological principles of brain plasticity, we have to reinforce knowledge daily. We have to reinforce knowledge in action. We have to hear it, we have to see it, we have to live it. And lastly, customized trainings and recurring trainings provides a platform for in-depth conversation and for a wider lens on diversity. So again, going back to that conversation about, if individuals start to feel victimized or villainized, or they start to feel like they're in the hot seat, it provides you a platform for understanding and shifting that idea in your brain and making you feel as though you are an active participant in anti-racist behavior, and you no longer see yourself as downtrodden or guilty. You see yourself as a person that is able to fundamentally enact change within your organization, your professional sphere, or in your personal life. So you start feeling less weak about things, and you start feeling a lot more empowered a lot more active in your own learning.
Absolutely. So just next steps to let you know a little bit, we will be following up with a resource list that will include some information about industry-specific challenges, potentially some reading materials, suggested things like that. You can always send us questions at this email address here, hello@enlighten-solutions.com. You can become a member, you can join our Discord server to have more chats with us. And we'd love to hear from you. So please reach out with your questions, suggestions, anything like that. I see we're at 11 o'clock. So we're excited. We appreciate your time and your attention. You'll be hearing from us. Chi-Chi, any last words?
Again, just feel free to email us. Again, we are open books. We enjoy dialogue. We enjoy conversation. And we enjoy that kind of honesty to be able to enact change in Northeast Ohio. We really love this area. I want to be here for a very long time. So I want to make sure that everybody is able to thrive. So definitely get in contact with us.
Chi-Chi and Bethany, thank you so much for all your expertise today and spending this honest conversation with us. We are so grateful. Before we conclude, just to let everybody know, this program was approved for SHRM and HRCI professional development credits. The PDC information was sent by email this morning. However, it will also be shared again in a day or two. Don't forget to check out our website, clevelandshurm.com, for future learning opportunities. This does conclude our formal programming. Thank you.